The morning Peter Easton rode into Calico Creek. The sky was the color of a bruise and the wind carried the first real bite of coming winter. And he had absolutely no intention of staying longer than it took to deliver a single folded letter and turn his horse back toward Abilene. That was October of 1878, in the high plains of Kansas, where the grass had gone the color of wheat straw, and the cottonwood trees along the creek bed had dropped half their leaves, leaving them scattered across the hard-packed dirt road like pieces of an unfinished letter. Peter rode a good bay gelding named Scout, and he had his collar turned up against the wind, and the letter was tucked inside his vest pocket, close to his chest where it would stay dry if the clouds decided to make good on their threat. He had been riding for 2 days, carrying messages for the Calico Creek Land Office, which was the kind of work a man took when he was between things and needed the money and did not want to ask too many questions about what he was doing with his life. He was 28 years old. He had dark eyes and a jaw that needed a razor's attention and hands that were roughened from years of working cattle and fence line and whatever else came along. He was not a remarkable-looking man at first glance, but there was something steady about him, something in the way he sat his horse and watched the land that made a person look twice. He had grown up in Missouri, moved west at 19, worked ranches from Texas to Nebraska, and somewhere along the way had lost the thread of whatever plan he had once had for his life. He was not unhappy exactly. He was just unmoored, the way a man gets when he has been moving so long that standing still feels foreign. The letter he was carrying was addressed to a Mrs. Birdie, Redmond, Calico Creek, Kansas. He had been told by the man at the land office that Mrs. Redmond ran a small homestead about 3 miles east of town, that her husband had passed some 8 months prior, and that the letter concerned a matter of land and deed that she needed to be made aware of as soon as possible. He found the place without much trouble, following the directions he had been given. A lane turned off the main road and wound through a stand of bare-limbed oaks, and at the end of it stood a house that was modest but well kept, built of cut stone and chinked timber, with a porch that ran the full width of the front. There was a kitchen garden to one side that had been put to bed for the season, the soil turned and mounded. There was a chicken yard with a proper fence and a small barn that was in better repair than half the barns he had seen on his ride out from town. A wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. Peter dismounted and tied Scout to the porch rail and climbed the 2 steps and knocked. She opened the door, and that was the moment that changed everything, though Peter would not have been able to tell you so at the time. He would have told you that she was a woman in a plain brown dress with her hair pinned back and flour on one hand from whatever she had been doing in her kitchen, and that she looked at him with clear gray eyes that held no particular fear, only a direct and measuring attention, the eyes of someone who had learned to assess strangers quickly and accurately. She was 26. Her name was Birdie Redmond, born Birdie Calloway, raised in a farming family in southern Ohio before her father had moved the family west when she was 16. She had married Thomas Redmond at 22, come with him to this Kansas homestead, buried him 8 months ago after a fever took him in February, and had been running the place alone since then, which was not a small thing. She had a fierceness to her that was not loud or aggressive but was simply present, like the steady heat of a good coal stove, something you noticed and were glad of. "I am looking for Mrs. Birdie Redmond," Peter said, touching his hat brim. "You have found her," she said. "My name is Peter Easton, ma'am. I am riding for the Calico Creek Land Office. I have a letter for you." She looked at the letter he produced from inside his vest, and something moved across her face, brief and contained. Then she took it from his hand and looked at the seal. "Will you be wanting a reply taken back?" "I was told there may be one, yes, ma'am." She looked up at him, taking in the road dust on his coat and the gray cast of the sky behind him. "The wind is getting serious," she said. "Come in and have some coffee while I read this. No sense in you standing out on the porch freezing." He hesitated one moment out of politeness, and she stepped back to make the opening wider, which settled the matter. The inside of the house was warm and orderly. There was a main room that served as kitchen and sitting room both, with a good iron stove at one end and a scrubbed table with 4 chairs in the middle and 2 upholstered chairs near the window at the other end. There was a braided rug on the floor and curtains on the windows and a shelf of books along one wall, which surprised him slightly. Not that women on the frontier did not read, but the shelf was substantial, a dozen volumes at least, and they had the look of books that had been opened many times. "Sit down," she said, nodding at the table. "I will pour." He sat, setting his hat on the table beside him, and watched her move to the stove with the efficiency of someone who knew her kitchen the way a carpenter knows his tools. She poured 2 cups from a pot that had clearly been keeping warm for some time, and she set his in front of him and sat across the table and broke the seal on the letter. He drank the coffee, which was strong and good, better than anything he had tasted in 2 days on the road, and he watched the light change on her face as she read. Whatever the letter said, it was not good news, though she received it with a stillness that he found remarkable. There was a small tightening around her eyes and a slight press of her lips, and then she lowered the letter to the table and was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on either side of the page. "Is it bad?" he asked, and then immediately thought he should not have, it being none of his business. She looked at him, seeming to consider him for a moment before deciding something. "It is a complication," she said. "My husband had a debt against the land that I was not fully aware of. The land office is informing me that payment on that debt is due by the 1st of April or the deed may be called in." She paused. "That is 6 months. Is it a large debt?" "Large enough." She picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands, and he noticed that her hands were strong and capable, the hands of someone who worked hard and consistently. "I have money set aside. I was not entirely without warning that things were not fully settled, but it will be a careful winter." "I am sorry," he said, and meant it. She looked at him again with that direct assessment. "You said your name was Peter Easton." "Yes, ma'am." "Are you from Abilene?" "I have been based there recently." "Originally from Missouri. Have you been writing for the land office long?" "About 3 months. It is temporary work." Something about the honesty of that answer seemed to interest her. She nodded slowly. "There is something almost freeing about temporary work," she said. "You are not obligated to pretend it is anything more than what it is." He had never thought of it quite that way, but he found he agreed. "True enough," he said. She stood and went to the window, looking out at the sky, which had gone a shade darker while they had been sitting there. "I need to write a reply," she said. "It will take me a little while. Will you have more coffee while you wait?" He looked down at his cup, which was empty. "That is a very good cup of coffee," he said honestly. "I would not say no." She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. She refilled his cup and went to the small writing desk in the corner and sat down with paper and pen. And Peter Easton sat at the kitchen table of Birdie Redmond's house in the high Kansas plains and drank coffee that was the best he had tasted in recent memory, and listened to the wind begin to pick up around the eaves of the house, and thought that this was a longer morning than he had expected, and that he did not particularly mind. She wrote for a considerable while. He heard the scratch of her pen, and the occasional pause, and the sound of the wind, and the settling of the fire in the stove. At some point she rose and added a piece of wood to the stove without seeming to think about it, and sat back down. He could have waited on the porch with his horse, and part of him knew that would have been the more proper thing, but she had invited him to sit, and the coffee was warm and the wind outside was not getting any kinder, and so he stayed. When she finished writing, she folded the letter and sealed it and brought it to him. "For Mr. Hatcher at the land office," she said. "I will see he gets it today," Peter said, and stood, picking up his hat. She walked him to the door. They stood a moment in the doorway with the wind coming in sharp and direct, and he looked out at the sky, which had continued its darkening all through the morning, and he realized with a slight check that the clouds had taken on the specific gray-white heaviness of snow clouds, the kind that held real weather and not just the suggestion of it. "You are going to catch weather on the road," she said, looking at the same sky he was looking at. "It may hold off," he said, though he did not quite believe it. "It may not," she said with the matter-of-fact pragmatism of a woman who had spent several winters in Kansas. "Calico Creek is 3 miles. You will be riding into that wind the whole way." He buckled his coat and settled his hat. "It is what it is," he said. She folded her arms across her chest, something happening behind her eyes that looked like an internal argument she was having very quickly and deciding rapidly. "I have bread in the oven and soup on the stove for the midday meal," she said. "If the weather gets bad, you are welcome to come back and wait it out before you ride on. I am not in the habit of sending people out into a storm." He looked at her. She held his gaze without any self-consciousness, which he found he admired. "That is a generous offer," he said. "It is a practical one," she said. "Good day, Mr. Easton." He rode out. The snow started before he reached the main road. It came in the way that first snow of a serious winter sometimes does, not as a slow preliminary dusting, but as a real and committed thing, the flakes large and wet, driven sideways by a wind that had been building all morning and now meant business. Scout's ears went flat, and the horse leaned into the wind with the reluctant determination of an animal that wanted very much to be in a barn. Peter had his coat buttoned to the throat and his hat pulled low, and he squinted through the thickening white and thought about the 3 miles of open road between himself and town, and realized inside of 2 minutes that this was not going to be a mild flurry. He turned Scout around. There was nothing heroic about the decision and nothing romantic, at least not in the moment he made it. It was simply the decision of a sensible man who had ridden enough open prairie in bad weather to know when the weather had the advantage. He rode back up the lane through the oaks, which were already accumulating white along their bare branches, and came back to the front of Birdie Redmond's house, where the smoke was still rising from the chimney in a steady thread. He knocked again. She opened the door and looked at him with the snow on his shoulders and his hat, and she said, "I thought you might be back," and stood aside to let him in. He came in and stood on her rag rug near the door, and she took his coat and hung it on the peg near the stove to dry. And the house was warm and smelled of bread baking and something savory. And Scout was already being led by her to the barn, because she had gone out herself with a practical lack of ceremony, and done it before he could offer. When she came back in, snow on her shawl and her cheeks red with cold, she hung the shawl and went to check the bread without pausing and said over her shoulder, "Sit down, Mr. Easton. It looks like you are here for the afternoon." That was how it began. They ate the midday meal together at the table, the bread still warm from the oven, and the soup, a thick vegetable and salt pork that tasted of long simmering and careful seasoning. The snow continued outside, pressing itself against the windows, and the light in the house went that particular muffled white that snowstorms make. Peter found himself in the strange, suspended comfort of a situation that was entirely ordinary and entirely unexpected at the same time. She was not a chatty woman. That is, she was not the kind who talked to fill silence. But she was not cold either, and she asked him questions when she was curious, directly, and without the kind of elaborate social preamble that required unpacking. She asked him what kind of work he had done before the message riding, and he told her about the cattle work and the fence work, and a stint helping survey land for a railroad outfit that had eventually gone bust. She listened with the focused attention of someone who actually wanted to know what the person across from them was saying. He asked her about the homestead, whether she was running it alone, and she said yes, for the most part. There was a man named Garfield who came twice a week from town to help with the heavy work, a retired blacksmith who was glad of the income and was reliable and decent. The chickens she managed herself. She had sold most of the cattle after Thomas died because she could not manage a full herd alone, but she had kept 4 cows for milk and butter, and had a kitchen garden that in summer had done very well, and she had put up enough food to see herself through the winter. "You are managing very well," Peter said, and meant it without condescension, which she seemed to receive correctly. "I am managing," she said, with a slight distinction in the emphasis that told him she knew the difference between managing and thriving and was honest enough to mark it. "The debt is a serious problem," he said, and again the bluntness of it surprised even himself, but she did not seem to mind. "Yes," she said, "but it is a solvable one, I think. If I am very careful and if the spring produce sells well and if I can take in some sewing work through the winter, I am a fair seamstress." "You are not thinking of leaving?" She looked at him as though the thought had occurred to her and been thoroughly dismissed. "This is my land," she said. "Thomas is buried on it. I am not leaving." There was a weight to that, not heavy in a dark way, but with the specific gravity of a person who has made a decision so fundamental that it is simply part of them. He found he respected it enormously. "Besides," she said with a slight lightening, "I like this place, even in winter, even with the complications. There is something about having a piece of earth that is yours that makes everything else feel manageable." He thought about that. He thought about how he had not had that, not since he left Missouri, and how it was not something he had grieved exactly, but perhaps should have. The afternoon settled in around them. The snow did not let up but seemed to find its rhythm, steady and serious. She brought out some mending to do and sat near the window in one of the upholstered chairs where the light, even filtered through snow, was better. He offered to check on Scout, and she said she had put the horse in the second stall with hay and water before their meal, so he was settled. He sat with his coffee, which she refilled without being asked, and he watched the snow and thought, which was something he had not done quietly in a long time. After a while she looked up from her mending and said, "There are books on that shelf if you want something to read." He went and looked at them. There was a Bible and a farmer's almanac and several novels and 2 books on natural history, and a volume of Tennyson's poetry that was worn smooth at the spine from handling. He pulled the natural history book because it was the kind of thing he had always meant to read more of, and he took it back to the table and read while she sewed, and the snow came down, and the stove ticked, and the afternoon became a kind of peace he could not have anticipated. It was around 3 in the afternoon, by the quality of the light, when she set her mending down and said, "Tell me something about you that is not about work." He looked up from the book, surprised. "That is a direct question," he said. "I find it is the most efficient kind," she said. He thought about it. "I play fiddle," he said finally, "badly but with conviction." She laughed then fully, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was a good sound, warm and unguarded. "That is a very good combination," she said. "Badly but with conviction. That describes a lot of worthwhile things." "What about you?" he said. "Something not about work." She considered. "I can name most of the stars visible from Kansas in any given season," she said. "My father taught me. We used to go out on clear summer nights when I was a girl, and he would point them out until I knew them all. It is the kind of knowledge that is of absolutely no practical use, and that I treasure more than almost anything I know." He looked at her in the afternoon snowlight and felt something that was not quite a word yet, but was the beginning of something. "I would like to see that sometime," he said. "The stars, with someone who knows their names." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at her mending, but there was something in the set of her mouth that had softened very slightly. "Perhaps in clearer weather," she said. He stayed for supper. This was not planned, at least not consciously. The snow continued, and the evening came early the way it does in October, the light going fast, and she made no move to suggest he should try the road again, and he made no move to leave. And at some point she simply stood up and went to the stove and began making supper as naturally as if they had been sharing the house for years. She made a venison stew from meat she had in the larder, with carrots and dried onions and some herbs she had put up from the garden, and cornbread in a cast iron pan. While she cooked, he set the table without asking, finding the plates and the cutlery in the places where she showed him once without any fuss, and they moved around each other in the small kitchen space with a naturalness that neither of them commented on. Over supper, they talked more freely than they had at midday. She told him about growing up in Ohio, about her father's farm and her mother who had died when Birdie was 14, and how that had changed everything in the family, how her father had become both harder and gentler at the same time, working himself past exhaustion, and then sitting up late reading aloud to his children, because he wanted them to know beauty was still available. She told him about the journey west, which had been long and hard and full of both terrible and wonderful things, and about meeting Thomas Redmond, who had been a good man, solid and kind and steady, who had wanted to build something on the Kansas plains and had begun to do it, and then had been taken before it was finished. She spoke of Thomas without grief that was raw or recent, with a sorrow that had settled into something she carried normally, the way a person learns to carry a weight when it is not going away. Peter listened without offering the usual inadequate consolations, and she seemed to appreciate that. He told her about Missouri, about his own father who had been a difficult man, not cruel but closed in a way that had left Peter always slightly hungry for something he could not name, about learning to ride and to work cattle from an older hand on the first ranch he had worked, a man from Texas named Cy who had been patient and exacting, and had taught Peter more about how to be in the world than his father ever had. About the years of moving ranch to ranch, state to state, and how what he had always told himself was freedom had sometimes felt, if he was honest, more like the inability to stay. She looked at him when he said that. "That is an honest thing to say about yourself," she said. "You asked for something real," he said. "I did," she agreed. After supper he washed the dishes, which seemed to surprise her slightly, and she dried them and put them away, and when they were done the kitchen was tidy and the stove was well stoked, and outside the snow had finally lessened to a thin and steady fall, the worst of it over, the world quiet and white. "You could make it to town now," she said. "The wind has dropped." "I could," he agreed. They stood in the warm kitchen, and the lamp between them made everything gold-edged and soft. He looked at her and she looked at him, and something that had been building through the afternoon and evening was present in the air between them, unclaimed but undeniable. "Thank you for the hospitality," he said. "The best meal I have had in a very long time." "You are welcome in it," she said. He put on his coat, which was dry and warm from hanging near the stove all day. She handed him his hat. Their hands did not touch in the exchange, but they came close, and the small distance between them felt significant in a way that neither acknowledged aloud. "I will see that Mr. Hatcher gets your letter first thing in the morning," he said. "I am grateful," she said. He went to the barn and saddled Scout, who came out of the warm stall reluctantly into the cold night air, and Peter rode back up the lane through the oaks, the snow muffling everything, the track white and clean in the moonlight that had broken through the departing clouds. He turned onto the main road toward Calico Creek. He rode about a quarter-mile and then stopped Scout in the middle of the road and sat there a moment in the cold and the quiet, looking at the stars which had come out sharp and cold and numerous, the way they do after a storm has cleared the air, and he thought about a woman who knew their names and about coffee and bread and venison stew, and about the sound of her laugh and the steadiness of her gray eyes. And he thought that he had been passing through places for nearly a decade, and this was the first one in a very long time where something in him had not wanted to leave. He delivered the letter to Mr. Hatcher at the land office the following morning, and he collected his pay for the 2-day ride, and then instead of taking the road back toward Abilene, he went to the rooming house on Calico Creek's main street and paid for a week's board. He told himself this was because there was more work available, which was also true. The land office had more messages to carry, and Mr. Hatcher had mentioned it. But if he was honest, and he was trying to be, he stayed because of her. He did not go back to her homestead immediately. That would have been too pointed. Instead, he worked for the land office for several days, carrying messages and documents in and around Calico Creek and the surrounding area, and he learned the lay of the land and the names of the neighbors, and he built a picture of the community in the way that a careful person does. He learned that Birdie Redmond was well regarded. People spoke of her as capable and self-contained, a woman who helped her neighbors and accepted help without a fuss when she needed it, who had managed her husband's death and the subsequent difficulties with a grace that people in small communities noticed and respected. He learned that there had been some trouble the previous spring when a man from town, a businessman named Calvin Hale, had made an offer for her land that she had refused, and that Hale had not taken the refusal gracefully, though nothing had come of it beyond some unpleasant words. He filed this information away without knowing entirely why. On the fourth day after his first visit, he had a legitimate reason to ride out to her place again, a document from the land office that required her signature to acknowledge receipt of the letter he had already delivered. This was standard procedure, and he was the natural person to carry it. He rode out on a cold, clear morning, the world still white and gleaming from the snowfall, and she was splitting wood when he came up the lane, her breath making clouds in the cold air, her movements efficient and powerful. She looked up when she heard Scout's hooves on the packed snow, and she straightened and waited. "Mr. Easton," she said, her face not fully readable but not closed either. "Mrs. Redmond," he said, dismounting. "I have a document from the land office requiring your signature." "I apologize for the additional trouble." "No trouble," she said, setting down the axe. She had a smear of bark dust on her cheek. She looked at him steadily. "You are still in town." "There is more work," he said. "Is there?" "There is," he said, and then after a moment, "and the truth is I found I was not in any great hurry to leave." She looked at him for a long moment with those measuring eyes, and he did not look away. A small thing happened at the corners of her mouth. "Come in and sign this document," she said. "I will put the kettle on." This second visit was easier than the first in the way that second visits often are, the strangeness having been removed, and only the reality of two people remaining. She made the coffee and he signed the document, and she signed the document, and then they sat at the table, and the conversation found its own level, natural and unforced. He asked if there was anything on the homestead that needed doing, speaking carefully, not wanting to imply that she could not manage. But she heard the question as he meant it. She thought for a moment and then said that there was a section of fence on the north side that had been weakened by the storm and that Garfield was not due until Thursday, and she was not sure the repair could wait. "I can look at it," he said. "I cannot pay you," she said directly. "I did not ask for payment," he said, equally directly. "I have a free afternoon and fence work is something I know." She looked at him again, that assessment, and then nodded. "All right," she said. "Finish your coffee first." He worked on the fence for 2 hours in the cold afternoon, pulling the damaged posts and resetting them, and she came out midway through with a cup of coffee and stood watching him work for a few minutes without saying anything, and then went back inside. There was something in that small gesture that he turned over in his mind while he worked. The way she had come out to check on him, not with instructions or fuss, but simply with coffee, and gone back without making a ceremony of it. When the fence was done, he came in and she had supper on the stove, and she said simply, "Stay and eat," and he did. This became a pattern over the weeks that followed, not a formal or arranged one, but one that grew up naturally like something seeded and tended without too much planning. He rode out 2 or 3 times a week on one pretext or another, messages or documents or simple visits that neither of them pretended were purely official, and he worked on things around the place that needed doing, and she fed him and they talked, and the thing between them grew steadily and without drama, which was perhaps the right way for it to grow. He learned her better by degrees. He learned that she was fiercely intelligent and had opinions about things that she would share if asked but did not impose, that she had a dry humor that appeared sideways in conversation and made him laugh before he saw it coming, that she was genuinely kind but without sentimentality, that she felt things deeply and disclosed them carefully, that she was not afraid of difficulty or hardship, but was sometimes lonely in a way she did not quite allow herself to fully acknowledge. She learned him similarly. She learned that he was more thoughtful than he appeared at first, that his long habit of moving through the world had made him observant in ways that were genuinely useful and interesting, that he was skilled with his hands and reliable with his word, that he had a patience that was not passive but active, the patience of someone who had learned that good things require waiting. She learned about the fiddle one evening when he brought it along without mentioning it beforehand, and after supper he played, badly but with the conviction he had promised, and she sat near the stove with her mending and her foot tapped slightly, almost involuntarily, and he saw it and felt unreasonably happy. November deepened and the cold settled in properly, the kind that comes to stay in Kansas, with nights that dropped hard and mornings when the water in the basin by the window had a skim of ice. He had been staying at the rooming house in town, but his work for the land office was expanding to include some surveying assistance that Mr. Hatcher needed, and the pay was steady enough to be comfortable. It was in the second week of November that Calvin Hale became a problem. Peter first saw him at the general store in Calico Creek, a thick-built man in his mid-40s with expensive clothes for the territory and the manner of someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was buying a large order of supplies with the easy authority of a man with credit to spare, and he was talking to the storekeeper about various pieces of property in the area with the proprietary air of someone who was already counting them as his own. Peter learned more about Hale by listening without appearing to, which was a skill he had. Hale had come to Calico Creek 3 years ago with money from somewhere back east, had bought the mill and then the hardware store, and then a section of prime land to the east of town, and had been methodically expanding his holdings ever since. He had a small empire in progress, and the Redmond homestead sat directly between two of his larger acquisitions, which made it useful to him in ways that had nothing to do with its actual worth. He asked around carefully, and the picture that assembled itself was not encouraging. Hale was not a violent man, not directly, but he was persistent, and he was willing to use legal pressure and financial leverage, and he had a lawyer who came up from Wichita when needed. The debt on the Redmond land, which Peter found himself thinking about increasingly, was owed to an institution in which Hale had some interest, though the connections were indirect enough to be deniable. He told Birdie about this on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-November, sitting at her kitchen table while sleet ticked against the windows. He laid it out carefully and without exaggeration, what he had learned and what it suggested, and she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had wondered about that. There was something in the way the letter was worded that felt like more than a routine notification." "It may be entirely legitimate," he said. "The debt is real, the timeline is real, but the pressure behind it may be intentional," she said. "That is my concern, yes." She stood and went to the window and looked out at the sleeting gray day. He watched the line of her back, the way she held herself upright and composed. "What options do I have?" she said, speaking practically, not desperately. "You could pay the debt before April. If you can raise the full amount, there is no legal mechanism for him to proceed. You could also look into whether the debt terms are properly documented, whether there are any irregularities that a lawyer could address. And you could make sure you have witnesses and proper documentation of everything you do between now and April." She turned from the window. "Do you know a lawyer?" she said. "Someone honest?" "Not in Calico Creek," he said, "but I can find out." "That would be helpful," she said. "Thank you, Peter." It was the first time she had used his first name, and he noticed it, and something in him warmed in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. He found a lawyer by the name of Elias Marsh in the town of Laramie Junction, 30 miles east, who had a reputation for honest work and fair fees, and a particular dislike for the kind of financial maneuvering that men like Hale preferred. He wrote the man a letter explaining the situation in general terms, and received a reply within the week indicating that the matter sounded like something worth examining, and that he could make the ride to Calico Creek if needed. He brought this news to Birdie on a Friday, and she read the letter and then set it on the table and looked at him. "You have been doing a great deal on my behalf," she said, and her voice held both gratitude and something more careful, an examination of what this meant. "I have," he said, meeting it honestly. "Because I wanted to." She held his gaze. "Peter," she said, and there was a quality to the way she said it that made the word carry more than his name. "Birdie," he said equally. Something passed between them, acknowledged but not yet spoken, like the moment before a door opens. Then she looked down at the letter on the table and said, "Write to Mr. Marsh and tell him to come. I will make sure I have funds for his fee." He wrote the letter that night at the rooming house and sent it in the morning and went back to work. November continued. He had by now established himself in Calico Creek well enough that he was known. People nodded to him on the street, and the rooming housekeeper had given him the better room on the second floor. He had kept working for Mr. Hatcher and had also taken on some work helping Doc Pruitt, the town doctor, who had a horse in need of regular exercise and no time to provide it. It was not a grand life, but it had a texture and a dailiness that he had not had in years, and he found he liked it more than he had expected. He went to the church on Sundays not out of any particular recent piety, but because it was where the community gathered and he wanted to be part of the community, which was a new desire for him, or at least a newly acknowledged one. He sat near the back and listened to Reverend Forsyth, who was a small, dry man but a sincere one, and he saw Birdie there most Sundays, sitting near the front with her neighbor Mrs. Abigail Foss, who was a broad, cheerful woman in her 50s who had apparently appointed herself Birdie's informal protector and social ambassador. Mrs. Foss noticed Peter noticing Birdie approximately 10 seconds after the first Sunday he attended, and wore this observation on her face with absolutely no attempt at concealment. He caught her eye, and she gave him a look of comprehensive and gleeful assessment, and he looked back at the front of the church with some dignity. After the service on the third Sunday, she came up to him directly, leaving Birdie in conversation with the Reverend's wife, and said, "Mr. Easton, Abigail Foss, I know who you are and what you have been doing for Birdie Redmond, and I think you ought to know I approve heartily." He was somewhat taken aback by this directness, though he was not entirely sure why, given the woman he had been spending his Wednesdays and Fridays with. "That is good to know, Mrs. Foss," he said. "She is a fine woman," Abigail said with emphasis. "The finest in this county, and I am not speaking loosely. She has had a very hard couple of years, and she deserves someone who is going to stay." The word landed with weight. "I know that," he said, and the steadiness of his voice surprised even himself. Abigail Foss looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of someone who had spent a great deal of time reading people and was rarely wrong about what she read. Then she nodded. "Good," she said, and went back to Birdie, and he stood there in the December sunlight outside the Calico Creek church feeling as though he had just passed some kind of examination. December came in cold and bright and sharp, the kind of winter that Kansas does exceptionally well, the sky an impossible deep blue above the white-covered plains and the air so clear that you could see for miles, and everything looked like it had been cut out of crystal. Peter had stopped counting his days in Calico Creek by the week because it no longer felt relevant. He was there. That was the fact of it. Elias Marsh came from Laramie Junction on the 8th of December. A thin, careful man with a briefcase and reading glasses, and the manner of someone who had seen a great deal and was no longer surprised by most of it. He spent an afternoon with Birdie going over the documents and the deed and the terms of the debt, and Peter sat at the table with them and helped where he could, mostly by having obtained copies of some of the relevant land office records which he had done at Mr. Hatcher's somewhat reluctant assistance. What Marsh found was not entirely what they had hoped for, but was better than the worst case. The debt was legitimate and properly documented, but its terms had been structured in a specific way that was designed to make default likely, with a compound interest clause buried in the language that had increased the amount owed beyond what Thomas Redmond had originally understood he was signing. This was not strictly illegal under the laws of the time, but it was the kind of thing a lawyer could argue about in front of a sympathetic judge, and Marsh thought there were grounds for requesting a restructuring of the terms, if not an outright reduction. "I will write to the holding institution," Marsh said, packing his papers back into his briefcase, "and indicate that I am examining the terms on behalf of my client. That alone will sometimes prompt a more reasonable discussion. Men like the one behind this prefer their leverage to be invisible. Once a lawyer is looking at the paperwork, they tend to become more accommodating." "And if they do not," Birdie said, "then we take it before a judge, and I believe we can make a case," Marsh said. "It will take time and some cost, but I believe we can prevail." After Marsh had gone, Birdie and Peter stood in the cooling afternoon in front of her house, both of them breathing out white clouds in the cold air, and she said, "That is better than I feared." "It is," he agreed. "It is also more than I could have managed alone," she said. "You would have managed," he said. "You are that kind of person." She looked at him sideways. "That is kind, but it is also not entirely true, and you know it." She paused. "I am grateful, Peter. More than I know how to say in the usual ways." "You do not need to say it in any particular way," he said. The afternoon light was going gold and long the way it does on December afternoons, and it was on her face and in her hair, which had come slightly loose from its pin in the wind. And he thought that he had been in many beautiful places in his life, but that this, precisely this, was something he would not trade for any of them. He thought about saying that, and then thought about whether it was the right time, and while he was thinking she said, "I made gingerbread this morning. Come in and have some." He went in and had gingerbread, which was excellent, with more of the coffee that he had come to think of privately as the best coffee in Kansas. They sat at the table and ate gingerbread and talked about Marsh and the next steps, and about what to do if Hale decided to escalate before the legal process had time to work. And they made a plan together, the two of them, with the naturalness of two people who had been planning things together for much longer than a month. Later that evening, after supper, she got out her coat and said, "Come outside. The sky is clear tonight." He got his coat and followed her out onto the porch, and they stood in the dark with the cold biting and the stars above them extraordinary, the kind of display that is only possible far from any town's lights, dense and layered, and so numerous they gave the sky a texture. She began to name them: Orion and the Pleiades and Cassiopeia in her bent W, Perseus and Auriga, and the winter hexagon of which she traced each point. She named them in the quiet, unhurried voice of someone sharing something precious, and he stood beside her in the cold and listened and watched where she pointed, and he found he could feel the shape of what she was showing him, the maps and the stories her father had given her, and that she was giving to him now. "My father used to say," she said, her breath white in the cold air, "that you can never be entirely lost when you know the stars. Not because they will always take you where you want to go, but because they are always there, the same ones, and knowing them is a kind of company." He was looking at her profile in the dark, the clear line of her chin and the cold pink of her cheek, and the way she looked up at the stars with an expression that was both private and offered. "Your father sounds like a remarkable man," he said. "He was," she said, and the small past tense of it told him something. "When did you lose him?" 3 years ago, just before we came west, when it was already decided. He never saw this place." She was quiet a moment. "I think he would have liked it. He liked open land. I think I would have liked to meet him," Peter said. She turned to look at him, and in the dark and the starlight and the cold, with the house warm behind them and the land white and quiet all around, something arrived between them that had been approaching for weeks and had now come to rest. He reached out and took her hand, which was cold, through her glove, and she let him, and her fingers closed around his, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Peter," she said finally. "I know," he said. "Do you?" she said. "I think so," he said. "Or I want to." She turned to face him properly, and he was looking at her, and there was a long moment in the cold and the starlight before she said, "You should know that I am not a woman who does things by half measures. If I am in something, I am in it entirely. That can be a difficulty." "I would not call that a difficulty," he said. "You might," she said. "Eventually." "Birdie," he said, "I have been looking for a reason to stay in one place for 10 years, and I did not find it until I knocked on your door to deliver a letter that I was not even supposed to be carrying, because the usual rider was sick, and I was available." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her thinking, measuring, the same careful assessment she had given him that first morning, but with a different quality to it now, something warmer beneath the deliberation. "That is a very good story," she said. "It is a true one," he said. She took a step closer, which in the circumstances was a very significant gesture, and said, "I am not ready to be hasty about anything. I want you to know that." "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I am in no hurry." "Then perhaps," she said, "we can be in no hurry together." Something in him that had been compressed for a very long time expanded slowly, like cold hands warming. "I would like that very much," he said. They stood in the cold for a while longer, her hand still in his, and she named a few more stars, and he listened, and the world was very quiet and very beautiful. He rode back to town that night feeling like a different version of himself, lighter in some essential way, as though something he had been carrying without knowing it had been set down. He sat in his room at the rooming house and could not read because the lamp kept blurring, and he kept thinking about gray eyes and the smell of coffee and gingerbread, and a woman on a porch naming stars. He slept better than he had in months. The days of December wound down, and the world outside Calico Creek was a study in white and cold and brilliant sky. Peter had by now accumulated enough regular work in and around the town to constitute a livelihood, between the land office and the surveying work, and some additional work that he had taken on helping a local rancher named Callum Birch manage his books, because it turned out that Peter had a good head for figures and Birch had too many cattle and not enough organization, and between them they had sorted out a system that saved Birch money and paid Peter fairly. He was building something. He could feel the shape of it emerging, the way a landscape emerges from morning fog, incrementally and with increasing detail. He had a room and work and a community, and he was courting a woman he admired more each week. He told Birdie about the work with Callum Birch on a Wednesday visit in mid-December, and she listened and then said, "Callum Birch is a good man but absolutely hopeless with his accounts. I know because his wife Martha has complained to me about it every spring when the numbers do not add up and the tax man is asking questions." She smiled, one of her full genuine smiles, which had become one of the things he most looked forward to in his days. "You may have saved his marriage," he laughed. "I will take whatever credit is available." She was working on a quilt that winter, a large and complicated thing in deep blues and greens and creams that she was making partly for warmth and partly for something to do with her hands in the evenings. He had watched it grow over the weeks of his visits, each new block of pattern added to the whole, and he had come to think of it as somehow representative of her, intricate and patient and beautiful in the assembling. He asked her about it one evening, and she told him her mother had taught her to quilt, and that this pattern was one her mother had used, and she had always meant to make one like it. There was something in the way she said it, the quiet matter-of-factness of carrying forward what had been given to her, that struck him as deeply characteristic of her, the way she held the past without letting it crush the present. Christmas came to Calico Creek with a dance at the church hall and a general sense of community warmth that Peter had not experienced in many years. He went with the honest pleasure of someone who had been welcome somewhere and knew it. He danced with Birdie twice, which was the right number to be noticed and significant without being the subject of excessive speculation, though Mrs. Abigail Foss noticed with great satisfaction and communicated this satisfaction to her husband in a voice not quite quiet enough for everyone nearby to miss. He and Birdie danced to a fiddle tune that the man playing it had not fully mastered, and she said under her breath, badly but with conviction, and looked up at him with that sideways humor, and he laughed and pulled her very slightly closer in the turn, and she did not step back. After the dance he walked her to the Foss wagon, where she was riding back with Abigail and Daniel Foss, and he held her hand to help her up into the wagon and held it a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she looked down at him from the wagon seat with those gray eyes in the lamplight and said quietly, "Come for dinner on Thursday." "I will be there," he said. He was there. The new year arrived, 1879, cold and quiet. Marsh had sent a letter indicating that his communication to the holding institution had prompted a response, and that there were preliminary discussions underway about restructuring the debt terms, which was the best news Birdie had received in months. She received it at her kitchen table on a January morning with Peter sitting across from her, and she read it twice and set it down and looked at him with something open and genuine and undefended in her face that was not something she showed easily. "It is going to be all right," he said. "It is beginning to look that way," she said. "I told you," he said. "You did," she said. "You told me." There was warmth in her voice. "You are frequently right, Mr. Easton. It is one of your more irritating qualities." "I will try to be wrong more often," he offered. "Please do not," she said, and her eyes were bright. January settled into its cold, and they settled into each other further, the courtship deepening with each visit, each meal shared, each conversation that went long into the evening. There were evenings when they sat on opposite sides of her hearth and read, she with her books and he with his, and the silence between them was the good kind, rich and comfortable, the silence of two people who do not need to fill space to feel connected. He told her things he had not told many people. About the time he had been 22, and had made a serious mistake in judgment on a cattle drive that had cost the rancher he worked for 3 steers, and had cost Peter the job, and had stayed with him for years as a lesson in the consequences of carelessness. About the brief period in his mid-20s when he had not been as careful with drink as he should have been, and how he had recognized it and stopped, and how that act of recognition was one of the things he was most honestly proud of in himself. About the loneliness of the years of moving, not romanticized loneliness but the real and sometimes grinding kind, the nights in bunkhouses when everyone around him had somewhere they belonged and he had only the next day's work. She listened without flinching and without reducing him. She said, "Everyone has the years that were not their best. The question is what you do with them after." "What did you do with yours?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I became very practical," she said. "When Thomas died, I spent about a week feeling everything all at once, which was necessary and terrible, and then I got up and I made decisions and I kept making them. That is what I did with mine." She paused. "I'm not sure I have entirely processed the grief yet, if I am being completely honest. I think sometimes I have been too busy to feel it fully." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat that way for a while without speaking, and it was one of the more intimate moments he had spent in his life. February came and the cold settled in with the serious permanence of the deep winter. Peter had by now arranged for a small second room at the rooming house that he used as an office for the surveying work, and he had enough regular income to think seriously about his situation. He thought about it with the deliberateness of someone who was not going to rush a thing, but was also not going to pretend. He did not know where he was headed. He went to Daniel Foss on a cold February morning, because Daniel Foss was the kind of man you went to when you wanted to do things properly in Calico Creek. Daniel was a farmer and a justice of the peace and a good man, and he had been Birdie's nearest neighbor and friend for 4 years, and Peter had come to know and respect him. He sat in Daniel's kitchen while Abigail Foss made a great show of finding reasons to be in other rooms while remaining within earshot, and he told Daniel that he intended to ask Birdie Redmond to marry him, and he wanted to know if Daniel had any objection or any counsel. Daniel looked at him for a long time with the unhurried consideration of a man who took things seriously. Then he said, "You plan to stay. Not just say it, but do it." "I plan to build a life here," Peter said. "Everything I have done since October has been toward that. The work, the community, being known here. I am not performing staying, I am staying." Daniel nodded slowly. "She has had enough of loss," he said. "She does not need a man who is going to decide in a year that he needs to be somewhere else." "I understand that," Peter said, "and I would not be doing this if I had any doubt in myself." Another long look. Then Daniel said, I think she cares for you more than she has let show to anyone. I think you would be good for each other." He extended his hand. "You have my blessing for what it is worth." From the other room, there was the sound of something being set down with slightly more force than was required, and both men looked at the doorway where Abigail Foss appeared with an expression of enormous satisfaction, and her arms crossed over her chest. "About time," she said to Peter. "I have been waiting for this conversation since November." He went on a Sunday in late February. He had thought about the words for several days, and then decided he did not want words that had been rehearsed too carefully, because she would know the difference and would prefer the real thing. He rode out in the afternoon after church, which she had not attended because she was treating a cold that had settled in her chest, and he found her in the house by the fire looking somewhat diminished but still herself, wrapped in a shawl with a cup of tea and her quilt spread across her lap. She looked up when he came in and said, "I thought you might come," and there was something in her eyes that told him she knew this was not an ordinary visit. He sat across from her and looked at her, and he said, "I am going to say something, and I want you to hear all of it before you respond." She set her tea down. "All right," she said. "I came to this town in October to deliver a letter," he said. "That is a very small thing to come to a place for. But I think I have understood for some months now that whatever brought me here, the letter was just the occasion. I have been looking for a home for 10 years without knowing that is what I was looking for, and I found it here in this town, in this community, and most particularly in you." He held her gaze. "You are the most honest and capable and remarkable person I have met in a very long time, Birdie. You make me want to be more careful about who I am, which is the highest compliment I know how to pay another person. I want to stay here. I want to build a life here with you. I am asking you to marry me." She was very still. He watched her face, which did what it sometimes did when she was moved, that careful interior process, the feeling happening behind the composure. Her hands were clasped in her lap over the quilt, and he could see that they were pressed together firmly. "Peter," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, "you have become more important to me than I intended to let anyone become. I want you to know that is not a small thing for me to say." "I know that," he said quietly. "I am not easy," she said. "I am stubborn and I have fixed opinions, and I will fight you when I think you are wrong, and I will not pretend otherwise." "I am counting on all of that," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and something released in her face, the held breath of a person who has been waiting longer than they realized to hear something specific. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He stood and came to her, and she put her hand up and he took it and held it, standing over her where she sat. And she looked up at him with eyes that were not quite dry, and she said, "Now sit down before I have to ask you to leave, because my chest hurts, and I cannot manage a dramatic moment properly when I am coughing." He sat down, still holding her hand, and laughed, and she laughed too, which made her cough. And he held her hand through the coughing and then poured her more tea. And that was their engagement, which seemed to him entirely perfect. Spring came to Calico Creek by degrees, the slow relenting of the cold, the first mud, the first tentative green along the creek, the cottonwoods putting out leaves in that particular yellow-green of very early spring, and with it came several things at once. Marsh wrote to say that the holding institution had agreed to restructure the debt at a reduced interest rate, and with a more reasonable timeline, acknowledging that the original terms had been, in Marsh's careful legal language, somewhat aggressively drawn. This was not entirely a victory of law, but also a practical capitulation on the part of the institution, which did not want a judge looking at its lending practices in this district. The practical effect was that the debt, properly restructured, was fully manageable on Birdie's income from the homestead. The threat of losing the land was over. She told Peter over dinner, and he put down his fork and said, "That is the best news this table has heard all year," which made her smile enormously. Calvin Hale was less than pleased, which became apparent when he approached Birdie after church one Sunday in March with a manner that was technically polite but carried the temperature of something colder. He said several things about the land's value and about how she might find things easier if she considered alternatives to struggling alone, and she looked at him with those clear gray eyes and said, "I am not struggling alone, Mr. Hale, and I will not be selling. Good day." She turned away and took Peter's arm, which he had offered at precisely the right moment, and they walked away together, and Peter could feel the set of her shoulders, not angry exactly but absolutely unyielding. "That man," she said under her breath, "has the emotional intelligence of a fence post." "That is a compliment to fence posts," Peter said. She pressed her lips together to contain something and walked straighter. Hale made no further direct approaches. It was understood in the community, by that process of understanding that happens in small communities without explicit announcement, that Peter Easton was Birdie Redmond's intended, and that the Redmond land was not in play. Hale turned his attention elsewhere, as such men do when an easier opportunity presents itself, and that was largely the end of it. They set the date for April, when Birdie's debt payment had been made and the land was fully secure, which felt to both of them like the right time, the beginning of a new thing once the old difficulty had been fully laid to rest. April on the Kansas plains was everything winter had been withholding, the sky coming back to full blue, the grass greening rapidly, the creek full and loud, the whole world insisting on itself. Birdie's kitchen garden was already dug and seeded, and she moved through her days with an energy that Peter associated with the spring, but also with something more personal, the specific energy of a woman who was moving toward something good. He had by March moved out of the rooming house and into a room with Daniel and Abigail Foss, which was the appropriate arrangement for a man in his circumstance. Abigail Foss was transparently delighted by this, and made it her mission to feed him enough to compensate for what she referred to as the clear evidence of insufficient nourishment over the preceding decade. And he accepted this with good grace and genuine appreciation, because the woman could cook. They were married on the 14th of April, 1879, in the Calico Creek Church, by Reverend Forsyth, with Daniel Foss standing up for Peter and Abigail Foss standing with Birdie, and about 40 people from the community filling the pews, because Birdie was well liked, and because a wedding in a small town on the plains in spring is a thing people come to willingly. She wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the winter, saved for this occasion, and she had her hair done differently than usual, down and then partially pinned. And she was beautiful in the way that a person is beautiful when they are entirely themselves in a moment that is theirs, not performing anything, just present. She came down the aisle with a measured and level step, and she met his eyes immediately and held them all the way, and he stood there in his good coat with his hat off, and thought that of all the things he had done and places he had been, this was the one he would tell the future about. The ceremony was brief and sincere. Reverend Forsyth read from Corinthians, which was customary, and they said their words to each other, the old words. And when Peter said "I do," he meant every syllable with a solidity that he could feel in his chest. And when she said it the way she did everything, without hesitation and without excess, clear and full and completely honest. There was a reception at the Foss farm afterward with music and food and considerable happiness, and Peter played his fiddle, badly but with conviction. And this time she danced to it, just for him, her eyes bright and her cheeks flushed with the dancing and the warmth of the room and the specific joy of the day, and it was a thing he would remember his whole life. They moved into the Redmond homestead together, which was now in every sense also his, and began the work of building a shared life with the same practicality and attentiveness that had characterized their courtship. He brought his tools and his books and his fiddle. He took the second bedroom as a workspace, and the barn became jointly managed. The cow herd expanded by 2 from a deal Peter made with Callum Birch. That first spring and summer as husband and wife was a working happiness, the kind that is not primarily about feeling but about the shared doing, the going out into the day together and coming back to each other. They planted the garden and mended the barn and extended the chicken yard and managed the books, and in the evenings they sat in the house, they were both making more theirs, talking about the day and reading and playing the fiddle and not playing the fiddle, and all the small necessary intimacies of two people learning to live well together. They disagreed. She had told him she would fight him when she thought he was wrong, and she did, directly and without drama, which he found he preferred enormously to the alternative. They had a serious argument in June about whether to take on a loan to add a new room to the house, she being opposed and he being in favor, and they went 3 days with the tension of it still in the air, and then on the 3rd day they sat down and talked it out and found a middle position that satisfied them both, and afterward he thought the argument itself had been useful, had told him things about how they worked together that were good to know. The summer was good. The Kansas summer in 1879 was generous, the rains coming at the right times and the heat not oppressive, and the harvest from the garden was excellent, and Birdie's preserved goods lined the larder shelves in deeply satisfying quantities. Peter's work with Callum Birch and the land office and the surveying combined into a livelihood that was more than comfortable for the homestead's needs. They paid the last of the restructured debt in full in August, 3 months ahead of the revised schedule, and that evening Birdie made a special supper and they ate it on the porch in the warm summer dark with fireflies in the grass and the sky going spectacular above them, and she held up her cup of coffee and said, "To the land," and he held up his and said, "To us," and they drank both toasts. He received a letter in August from his brother in Missouri, the first contact they had had in some years. It was a cautious letter, not warm but not closed either, acknowledging that they had lost touch and expressing some desire to know how Peter was doing. He wrote back carefully, telling of his marriage and his life in Calico Creek, and the return letter that came in October was warmer, congratulatory, and suggested that perhaps at some point a visit might be possible. Peter showed Birdie both letters and she read them thoughtfully and said, "Family is worth the effort, even when it requires patience," and he agreed. The autumn came again and the anniversary of his first arrival in Calico Creek, and he mentioned it at breakfast one October morning, and Birdie looked up from her oatmeal and said, "1 year. 1 year since I knocked on your door with a letter," he said. She looked at him across the table in the morning light with the sound of the wind outside and the smell of the coffee between them. "You were terribly serious," she said. "You came in looking like a man who had been riding through the weather and thinking about everything too hard." "I was," he said honestly. "I still do both." "I know," she said. "I married them in with you." He reached across and took her hand on the table, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat that way in the October morning, comfortable and warm. And he thought that this was the thing he had not known he was riding toward for all those years. This kitchen, and this morning, and this hand. That October they found out she was expecting, and that too was a kind of completion, a full circle closing. She was steady and matter-of-fact about it in her characteristic way, telling him in the evening by the fire without preamble, and he had gone quiet in the way of someone who feels too much to speak immediately, and she had watched him with patient amusement while he collected himself. "Are you all right?" she said. "I am better than all right," he said when he could speak. "I am just trying to accommodate it." "You have some time to accommodate it," she said dryly. "It does not arrive immediately." "Birdie," he said. "Peter," she said. He crossed to where she was sitting and he crouched down in front of her chair and took her face in his hands, and she looked at him with those gray eyes, clear and steady and warm, and he said, "I am the luckiest man in the state of Kansas." "You are certainly in the running," she said, and her eyes were very bright, and he kissed her in the firelight in their house on their land in the October evening, and outside the wind was beginning to carry the first whisper of winter, and he did not notice it at all. The winter of 1879 to 1880 passed with the specific comfort of a household that is full and occupied and anticipating. The cold settled in November, familiar now, and Birdie's garden was put to bed and the stores were full and the stove was well fueled and the house was warm. She finished the quilt in December, the blue and green and cream one that had been growing all year, and she spread it on the bed and stood looking at it with a satisfaction that was quietly profound, and he came to stand beside her and looked at it too. "Your mother's pattern," he said. "Yes," she said. She would have liked seeing it finished. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him slightly, which was the kind of small physical trust that meant more to him than the larger gestures. "She would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," he said. "She would," Birdie said with certainty. She liked men who meant what they said. The baby came in the spring, April of 1880, almost exactly a year after their wedding. He was a boy, which surprised neither of them exactly, but which they had not quite anticipated either, the reality of a son being something different from the abstraction of one. He was born on a clear morning with Abigail Foss in attendance as midwife, Abigail being a woman of formidable practical competence in most matters including this one. And Peter paced the kitchen for 4 hours, which was not his finest demonstration of steadiness, and which Abigail later told him was to be expected, and that she had seen doctors do worse. When it was over and Abigail came to tell him he had a son and that Birdie was well, he stood in the kitchen of his house with his hands in fists at his sides and breathed in a very unsteady way for a moment. They named him Thomas William Easton. The Thomas was for Birdie's first husband, which was Peter's suggestion, and which she received with a look that was so full it had no words, and the William was for Peter's father, which was a complicated gift but the right one, a gesture of the kind of reconciliation that does not require the other person to have been perfect. William was a good name and his father had given it to him, and that would do. Thomas William was a large, healthy, loud boy with his mother's eyes and his father's dark hair, and an opinion about everything from the first week of his life, which seemed entirely appropriate for his parentage. Birdie nursed him and tended him with the same efficient competence she brought to everything, but there was something additional in the way she held him that Peter had not seen in her before, something that had come unlocked, a tenderness so direct and undefended that it was almost a new version of her, the same woman with one more layer revealed. He came to the doorway one morning when Thomas was about 2 weeks old, and she was sitting in the chair by the window in the early light, the baby at her breast, and she was looking down at the child with an expression on her face that he did not have adequate words for, and she looked up and saw him and said nothing, only held his gaze, and he came and sat on the edge of the bed nearby, and they were all 3 of them quiet in the morning light. And it was one of those moments that you know while they are happening is something you will carry in your chest for the rest of your life. The homestead continued to grow. The summer of 1880 was a working one, with Peter expanding the cattle operation on a modest and careful scale and Birdie managing the household and the garden, which she had extended by a full additional row that year, and Thomas growing with the rapid determination of all healthy babies. Garfield, the retired blacksmith who had been coming to help, stayed on as a regular hand when the workload increased, and proved to be a man of great value and few words, and a constitutional reliability that Peter came to depend on. Abigail Foss was across for dinner most Sundays that year, which meant Daniel was too, and the 4 of them made a comfortable community around the Easton table, the children of the Foss family grown and mostly gone to their own lives, but still remembered in the stories and the laughter that filled those Sunday evenings. Peter looked around those tables sometimes, at Birdie across from him, managing 3 conversations at once while cutting bread, at Daniel telling a story about the county government with his wry, slow delivery, at Abigail laughing at something Thomas had done with the seriousness of a baby encountering a spoon for the first time, and he felt a fullness that was simply joy, uncomplicated and earned. He wrote to his brother Samuel in Missouri twice a year. The correspondence had grown gradually warmer over the year and a half since they had resumed it, the old distances between them slowly bridging. In the autumn of 1880, Samuel wrote to say that he was thinking of coming west in the spring, and Peter wrote back to say that there was a place at their table and a room if he needed it, and meant both. Samuel came in May of 1881, thinner than Peter remembered and quieter, a man who had had some difficult years that the letters had only partially disclosed, and Peter met him at the stage stop in Calico Creek, and they stood looking at each other in the May morning. Two men with the same Missouri jaw and the same eyes and 10 years of distance between them. And then Peter extended his hand, and Samuel took it, and then they put their arms around each other briefly. The way men do who have not learned to do it easily, but are doing it anyway. Birdie had Thomas on her hip when they came up the lane, standing on the porch in the afternoon sun, and she looked at Samuel with the same direct assessment she had given Peter on that first morning, which Peter found privately amusing, and then she said, "You look like your brother. Come in. I have made a real dinner." Samuel stayed 3 weeks, and it was good. He was good with Thomas, who was just over a year, and at the stage of pulling himself upright on furniture and regarding the world from that new height with enormous satisfaction. And Samuel, who had no children of his own, was charmed by this in a way that he seemed surprised by in himself. He and Peter worked side by side on some fence repair and some cattle management and talked, not about the old things immediately but around them and gradually through, and by the end of his visit they were on terms that felt real rather than performed. When Samuel left he said he would come back, and Peter believed him. The letter from Elias Marsh came in June of 1881, a friendly one, not business, just the correspondence of a man who had stayed in touch with clients he liked. He mentioned that Calvin Hale had finally overextended himself in his land acquisition campaign and had been forced to sell the mill at a loss when a larger operation moved into the area, which was the kind of news that arrived without drama or justice in the universe, but with the quiet satisfaction of things working themselves out. Peter read the letter to Birdie over coffee, and she listened with her chin resting on her hand, and when he finished she said, "Well," with a finality that contained many things. "Well," he agreed. She picked up her cup and drank from it and looked at the kitchen around her, the table and the stove and the good light coming in through the windows onto the scrubbed floor, and out through the window she could see the garden in its summer abundance and the barn in its good repair and the lane through the oaks that wound back to the road, and above it all the enormous Kansas sky, the blue of it today something approaching sacred. "I am glad we stayed," she said. "We were never leaving," he said. She looked at him across the table with those gray eyes that he had learned in 3 years to read like weather, and what he read in them was contentment and love, and the particular steady satisfaction of a life that has been built deliberately and well. "No," she said, "we were never leaving." Thomas toddled in from the other room at that moment, having woken from his morning nap, his hair in disarray and his eyes still heavy with sleep, and made directly for his father with the urgent purpose of a child who knows where he is going. And Peter caught him under the arms and swung him up, and the boy laughed, that pure surprised baby laugh that is one of the unrepeatable sounds in the world. And Birdie watched them both with a look that she no longer contained or was careful about. That direct open love. "More coffee," she said. "Always," he said. She got up to pour, and he held his son and looked out the kitchen window at the June morning, and thought about a bruised sky in October, and a knocked door, and a woman with flour on her hand who had looked at him without fear and offered him coffee, and how everything that mattered had grown from that single morning, from the particular and unremarkable grace of being invited in out of the weather and given a warm cup and a place to sit. He had come to deliver a message. She had invited him to stay for coffee, and by the time the snow had fallen, he had already understood, somewhere below words, that he was not going to leave. In the autumn of 1882, when Thomas was 2.5 and Birdie was carrying their second child, they sat out on the porch on a clear October night that felt very much like a certain October night 3 years before, and she named the stars again, Orion and the Pleiades and Perseus in his autumn place, and he listened the way he always listened to her, completely. And Thomas sat on his lap wrapped in a blanket and looked up at the vast dark sky with the enormous wonder of a child encountering infinity, and pointed at various lights and demanded to know what they were. "That one," Birdie said, pointing, "is Orion, the hunter. You can see his belt, those 3 stars in a row." Thomas stared at the stars with great concentration and then pointed upward with a small decisive finger. "Mine," he said. Peter and Birdie both laughed, and the laugh rose up into the cold, clear night, and the stars were there as they always were, the same ones, steady and numerous and available to anyone who had someone to name them. Their second child was another boy, born in the deep winter of February 1883, healthy and loud and immediately his own person, as children are. They named him James Owen Easton, the James being a name that had no particular story, but that both of them had liked independently when they tried it aloud, and the Owen was for Daniel Foss, whose middle name it was, and who received this honor with a reddening around the eyes that he managed to contain through the force of considerable dignity. James was different from Thomas in the way that children who come from the same parents and the same house are nevertheless their own complete universes. Where Thomas was deliberate and observational, James was immediately and physically in everything, pulling himself across floors, and then standing and then walking earlier than Thomas had, and clearly intending to continue in this vein indefinitely. Birdie managed this with the equanimity of someone who had learned that children are not projects to be managed but people to be known, and what she did was know them, both of them, with the same focused and complete attention she brought to everything. The homestead in the spring of 1883 was a different place from the one Peter had first ridden up to in October 1878, both the same and transformed, the way places are when they are cared for over years. The house had a new room added, the addition he had wanted and she had been cautious about, and that they had finally agreed on the previous summer, which gave the children their own space and gave Birdie back her workroom for the sewing she still did, not out of financial necessity now, but out of a genuine pleasure in the work. The barn was larger and better, the cattle herd was modest but solid, the kitchen garden was a serious productive operation. He stood at the fence one April morning looking at all of it, the house with smoke from the chimney and the sound of Birdie's voice, inside talking to Thomas about something with the patient repetition of a mother explaining a thing for the 3rd time, and James's insistent commentary from his corner of the kitchen, and the cows in the morning light and the oaks down the lane putting out their new leaves, and the whole landscape, so familiar to him now that it was internal, laid out under the immense blue sky. He heard the door and her step on the porch, and she came to stand beside him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands, and she gave him one, and they stood together at the fence looking at their land. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That I am the luckiest man in Kansas," he said. Still in the running," she said, which was what she had said almost 4 years ago in front of their hearth, and her voice carried the full weight of all the years since, warm with them. He put his arm around her, and she settled into him the way she had learned to, without ceremony, simply because it was where she fit, and they drank their coffee in the April morning, and the land was theirs, and the children were inside, and the sky was that impossible Kansas blue above them, and there was nothing unresolved, nothing pending, nothing owed. The debt was paid. The land was theirs. The years were full. The stars had names. He had come to deliver a message, and she had offered coffee, and the snow had come down and kept him, and all the rest of it, the years and the children and the garden and the stars and the early mornings and the long evenings and the work and the disagreements and the laughter and the warmth of a good house on a cold night, all of it had grown from that. He was still there. He would always be there. And in the kitchen behind them, Thomas Easton, 3 years old and already his mother's son in the best of ways, climbed onto the kitchen chair and pointed at the window where he could see his parents standing at the fence in the morning light, and said with the certainty of a child who knows the permanent things, "Ours." Birdie would have approved of that. She did.